In this example, I want to go ahead and take a look at how our JavaScript application will interact with server-side code using an XML HTTP request object. So I'm going to start with an HTML page. And the title of this is going to be just XHR. And XHR stands for XML HTTP request. It's an object that's built into the browser that's going to allow us to interact with server-side code asynchronously. And there's some more modern APIs that we'll deal with throughout this semester, but for the time being, this is kind of the basis of all of our Ajax requests. So I'm going to go ahead and have a script source that's going to be xhr.js, and I'm going to go ahead and save this. And what I want to do is I want to save this into my documents directory. So this is actually my library web server documents directory. It's my web server root directory. And the reason I'm saving it in there is because I want to execute some server-side code. So the server-side code that I want to execute is going to be in PHP. So really simple server-side code, but I do need to execute that server-side code through a web server. So I'm going to have a new folder called XHR. And then this file name will be index.html. Okay, so this is the starting point. And then in my JavaScript file, so xhr.js, I want to trigger a JavaScript process. So I'm going to have an init method that's equal to some function definition. And I'm going to trigger that in the window.onload event. And I got to get my keyboard set up. So I have my onload event. And what I want to do is I want to interact with some server-side code. In order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a PHP file. So hello.php. And this is going to be really straightforward where my PHP file is just going to output some text. Right? So I'm going to go ahead and echo Cubs stink. Okay, so we're just getting a message from our hello.php, and the idea here is that I'm going to type in localhost, which is going to take me to my web server root directory, and then I have a folder called xhr, and then that file name is hello.php, and you can see that we get our output Cubs stink. Okay, so we have our server-side code up and running. And I just want to be careful to point out my server-side code is just the text. So you'll notice I didn't put HTML tags around this or make this an HTML document. My server-side code, as it relates to a JavaScript application, is going to be just data. And when we're talking about just data, we're talking about plain text. So for instance, Cubs stink. Or, you know, if I asked how many employees worked for a particular company, you might give me an answer. So, 50 employees. So plain text. Another example would be JSON. So that'd be another data type that I could have. And an example of that would be, why don't you give me a list of all the employees? And that's going to come back as a collection of employee objects that I might represent as JSON. And then the third type of data that we're going to deal with is XML. And again, that could be the same exact information that you're getting in JSON, but as an XML object. Okay, so in our case, if I view the page source, you'll see the page source is literally just this plain text. There's no HTML tags around it. And what that allows me to do is I don't have to then filter through that string trying to parse out what the data is. The data is just available for me. Okay, so that's why we're just echoing out the Cubs stink string. Okay, so then I want to take that information and I want to bring that over to my JavaScript application. Okay, so in my JavaScript application, I want to get that message, and that message can obviously be more complicated than just Cubs stink, but in this case, we just want to get that text message and then render it on the screen. So right now, if I look at index.html, there's nothing there, but I want this page to interact with my server-side code hello.php. Okay, so then we can code that up. In order to do that, we want to have an XMLHttpRequest object. So here's my XMLHttpRequest object. And if you look back at our old videos, we use this object to interact with our XML file. This is the same object. Okay, and then we're going to need a URL. So what server-side code are we actually interacting with? The URL that we're going to use is hello.php. And then this actually gets fairly straightforward, and I want to kind of keep it simple to start with, and then we can kind of grow this application from there. When I have an XML HTTP request object, really the only two things that I can do is I can open it and I can send it. When I open it, I have to specify the HTTP request method. Usually you're going to see that as either a get or a post. And for our purposes, we're going to be doing HTTP gets, and we're going to specify the URL that we want to go get. So this is the line of code that basically says, what are we doing on the server? So we're going to have a JavaScript application over here, and we want to interact with some server-side code. This is the method that does that. I apologize, my dog's barking in the background. I'm going to go close the curtains so she stops barking. So this is the method that basically tells us which server-side URL we're going to have getting executed as a result of our JavaScript code. So this is the point right here where we specify that integration. Like here, our JavaScript application is calling out to our server-side code, and our server-side code happens to be PHP, but it really could be any language. It could be Java, it could be .NET, it could be Python or Ruby or Perl. We're using PHP. So that's the first step, is we have to specify how we're going to interact with our server. And then the second step is we actually have to send the request. Okay, and when we send the request, you'll notice that it's taking one parameter, and I'm saying that one parameter is null. That one parameter being null, in this case, it has to do with our HTTP headers, and we're not passing any data to the server via our HTTP headers. So that's why that parameter is going to be null. Okay, so this is it. This is it in its simplest form. This is what Ajax looks like. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save it. I come back over to my browser. I want to inspect, so it brings up the developer tools. And here's kind of the trick, is I want to look at my network traffic. And if I look at my network traffic, I can resize that window a little bit, you'll notice that I get my HTML file, I get my JavaScript file, and then as a result of my JavaScript code executing, I'm actually going out and executing that server-side code, hello.php, and if I click on that, I can see the response. Okay, so all of that's happening. Okay, great, that looks good so far. This is kind of the simplest form of Ajax. So I might want my JavaScript application to trigger some server-side code, like maybe I'm doing a validation check to say, you know, is this a unique username? And if it is, then maybe I don't want to show the user anything. Maybe all is good and we're going to continue on with the process. The user never even knows that I made that background check. Whereas if the username is not unique, I might want to highlight the username field and give an indication that all is not good. This isn't a valid username because it's already in use. Okay, so this is kind of the simplest form of that. Most of the time, we want to know what our server-side response is. So at the beginning of this video, we talked about, you know, how we could get data back from our server, and it could come as plain text, it could come as JSON, it could come as XML. In our case, we're getting plain text back, and most of the time, I want to actually grab that server-side response. So I've executed the server-side code. That's where the integration came in. My JavaScript application requested some server-side code to execute. That server-side code has now generated a response, and most of the time, I want to capture that response. Okay, so I'm going to do that right here, and this is kind of an awkward place to do it. What's going to happen is I'm going to set up an event handler right here, and the event handler is basically going to say, you know, when you do get a response back from the server, what should I do with it? Most of the time, if we were doing this, we'd do it sequentially. I open it, I send it, I get the response. However, this XML HTTP request object is not sequential, meaning there's going to be a delay here in the actually getting the response. If I ask what the response is right here, so let me just do a console.log of the xhr.response text. Okay, so I go ahead and save it. I refresh the page. You'll see in my console window, there is no response. The response text, there is no response text. It's empty. Okay, I'm surprised it's not saying null, but there is no response text. Okay, I haven't gotten the response back from the server yet. So I send it, and then that response text is not immediately available to me. There's a delay here. I have to wait for the server-side response to come back. And the way I end up getting this response text, so I do want this property, the way I end up getting this response text is I have to define a callback. And what the callback does is it basically says, I know you don't have the answer right now. So I know that when I send this request, I'm not going to get an immediate answer. I have to wait for the answer. So instead of sitting around and waiting for the answer, what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically set up a notification system. And the notification system is basically saying, hey, when you do have an answer back from the server, let me know about it. Okay, so we're going to set that up right here in between the open and send. We're going to say on ready state change, we have some function definition. And this ready state change is actually an event handler. And the ready state is going to go through different states. It's going to go from state 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. And all of those states are basically measuring progress for this HTTP request. And we don't necessarily care about the details of those different states, but they're basically progress indicators. And what we do care about, though, is we care about when this response text has an actual valid value. Meaning we made our request, it went over the server processed our request and sent us a response, and now we have the response. So we care when that actual response text is available for us. And the way we're going to check that is we're going to check if the ready state is equal to 4. If that's the case, then we should be able to take this console.log message that we had below, and let's move it up into our conditional where we have this in our callback. Okay, so now if I come back over here, you'll see in the console that we get our message from our server-side code. Now we're getting notified, hey, the server-side code executed, it's generated a response, and now that response is available for us to use. Now you'll notice that we actually get that response logged in the console. Okay, so earlier in the video I talked about how we don't embed this PHP code inside of HTML. And so if I just take this and use HTML and somehow take this PHP script and embed it inside the body, and if we look at hello.php, it still looks the same, but if I actually view the page source, you'll see it has all this HTML stuff around it. We don't use that for our Ajax requests, and the reason we don't use that for our Ajax requests, so if I go back over to my index.html file, now you'll notice the response is that entire HTML document. So anything that gets output to the user via your server-side code gets mapped directly to your response text. So if I'm echoing something out or printing something out or I have it nested with inside of HTML, that's what my response text is. Okay, so now if I'm looking at this HTML document that I have over here in my console, it's pretty hard to get the message. So for instance, let's say I wanted to build an H1 tag and then output that H1 tag. Well, I want the message, the Cubs stink message, and I want to put it in an H1 tag. It's pretty hard to get out. I don't want to sort through and figure out what's the HTML tags and then what's actually the message. I only care about the message. So I'm just going to undo all of that HTML stuff. I just want my PHP code. And now when I have my PHP code, now the response text is literally just the answer I'm looking for. I might do something like, my response text is really that message of the day. So let message of the day equal. I can generate an H1 tag. So let heading equal to document.createElement. I can take the heading and set the inner HTML equal to the message of the day, and then I can append it to the body. Okay, so now we get our H1 tag saying that the Cubs stink. Okay, so if you happen to be a Cubs fan, you don't want to use Cubs stink, you want to change your message of the day. So instead of Cubs, we use, Vikings. Now you'll notice that my client-side code is calling out to my server-side code. It's interacting. There's an integration there. And whatever that message of the day is, I'm getting that response from the server and life is good. Okay.